Welcome, everyone. Tonight's webinar is Blowing the Whistle on Drone Warfare. We'll be talking with three people with deep knowledge on the subject who are also involved in a stunning documentary about US drone warfare called National Bird. We're going to draw on that documentary to launch our discussion, but if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, don't worry about it, because I think our conversation will be completely accessible and meaningful to everyone. But I do all urge you to watch it if you haven't. It is available on Amazon Prime for free if you're willing to watch the commercials, and there are a few other sites where you can rent it. I'm Chris Oppie. I teach history at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm the director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. I'll serve as moderator for tonight's discussion. It's one of the many events in a year-long program called The Whistleblower Project, a series on public interest truth-telling. The Ellsberg Initiative was inspired by Daniel Ellsberg, who in 1971 released to the press and public the Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page classified history of the Vietnam War that exposed decades of US government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of that war. In response, the government indicted him on more than a dozen felony counts, including the Espionage Act of 1917, and he faced a possible 115-year prison sentence. He was, in fact, the first American in our history to be criminally charged under the Espionage Act for giving classified government documents, not to a foreign agent or nation, but to the US press and public. The case against Ellsberg never made it to the jury because toward the end of the trial, the Watergate investigations revealed evidence that the White House had committed serious crimes against Ellsberg in an effort to silence and discredit him, including breaking into the offices of his psychiatrist. So the judge really had little choice but to declare a mistrial. Dan Ellsberg died in June, and as many of you certainly know, he has been an inspiration to countless activists and whistleblowers, including, I'm quite sure, all three of tonight's panelists. This afternoon at UMass, we screened the documentary National Bird, a remarkable film about the US drone warfare program. Drones have been a growing part of US military operations since 9/11, not only against targets in acknowledged US war zones like Afghanistan and Iraq, but in essentially secret military operations in Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, Somalia, and elsewhere. And it is not a US weapons program alone, as we are more and more realizing. Many other countries are developing and using drones. National Bird focuses largely on three Americans who were part of the drone warfare program in the military and came to oppose it so vehemently that they began speaking out against it. The whistleblowers featured in the film are Heather Linebaugh, Lisa Ling, who joins us tonight, and Daniel Hale, who was convicted under the Espionage Act for giving classified documents about the drone program to a media site called The Intercept. He was convicted under the Espionage Act and is now serving a 45-month prison sentence. We'll be talking more about him later. The film also takes us to Afghanistan, where we meet some of the civilian victims of US war strikes, and we'll pick up on that subject as well. One final note before introducing our guest, I just want to point out that drone warfare has been defended and justified, perhaps most forcefully by President Barack Obama, as a precise and effective way to protect the US from terrorism. In 2012 and 2013, Obama claimed that drone attacks were only authorized against specific senior operational leaders of Al-Qaeda in situations where we couldn't capture the individual before they moved forward on some sort of operational plot against the United States. The film National Bird makes clear that in practice, these sanctioned assassinations were hardly precise and surgical and hardly limited to senior terrorists on the verge of attacking the US, or even, for that matter, limited to Al-Qaeda targets, but in fact, often killed civilians as well as lower-ranking members of a number of organizations and parties. Indeed, one of the classified documents turned over by Daniel Daniel Hale to The Intercept, documented a 5-month stretch in 2012 in a drone program in Afghanistan called Operation Haymaker that killed more than 200 people, but only 35 of those 200 were the intended target. Yet all 200 were declared enemies killed in action. If anything, Trump loosened regulations further after Obama and used more of them. Biden has pulled back a bit, but we'll see where we go from here. I should say that the film National Bird was released back in 2016, but I would argue that it remains as timely and relevant as ever, and I wish many more Americans would watch it. So now, finally, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. If you want more detail about them, you can find it on our website, eipad.org. Sonia Kennebeck is an award-winning director, producer, and investigative journalist. Tonight, we're focusing on her film, National Bird, but just last month, she released a documentary about Reality Winner, the whistleblower who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for giving to the media a classified document about Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Another of her recent films is called Enemies of the State, which was named the best political documentary of 2021 by Critics' Choice. And National Bird received the 2017 Ridenour Documentary Film Prize, named after Ron Ridenour, the Vietnam veteran whose whistleblowing led to a full investigation of the My Lai massacre that the Army had successfully covered up for 18 months in the late 1960s. Lisa Ling is one of the 3 whistleblowers featured in National Bird. She entered the Army in the early 90s as a medic, a surgical technician, and nurse. Then she later transferred to the Air Force and Air Force Combat Communications. And beginning in 2004, she started working on various aspects of the drone program, collecting and analyzing intelligence from reconnaissance aircraft and drones on suspected terrorists. She has a history degree from UC Berkeley, and this year she is a research fellow at the Disruption Network Institute, which is devoted to research on how artificial intelligence impacts new technologies of war, or what Lisa Ling calls the kill cloud. Jesselyn Radack is an attorney who runs the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program at an organization called Expose Facts, where she provides free legal representation to whistleblowers and media sources with a focus on human rights and civil liberties. She has represented dozens of national security employees who have been prosecuted under the Espionage Act for allegedly mishandling classified information, including Edward Snowden, Thomas Drake, and Daniel Hale. Daniel Ellsberg called Jesselyn Radack our nation's foremost defender of national security whistleblowers. She is also the author of a memoir about her own experience as a whistleblower called Traitor: The Whistleblower and the American Taliban. So I'd like to begin with a question to each of our guests to help introduce them to you. First, Lisa Ling, since there are probably some people listening in who haven't yet seen National Bird, I'd love if you would talk a little bit about your own personal and political life experience from the time you entered the military to your experience with drone warfare, and how and why you came to oppose it.
So when I joined the military, it was pretty much pre the internet as we know it today. And I watched as technology became more and more invasive over time. In the early 90s, I ended up going to Panama, and I remember the president of Panama saying, "We really appreciate you helping us build roads. We appreciate all the work that you're doing, but please don't mess with our culture," basically. And I never forgot that. And over time, I saw how the military was not necessarily the force for good that I had thought it was, and basically, It wasn't that, you know, a lightning bolt hit me and all of a sudden I had these opinions. I started doing things like picking up books about history and that kind of thing. And over time, I began to see what was really happening. So,
Great. Well, we'll come back to you and ask your advice on things we might do in response to your insights and experiences and convictions. Sonia Kennebeck, I'd be curious to know that when you have gone around various parts of the world, really, to present National Bird um, to audiences and listened to their questions and comments about the film, I'm wondering what has struck you about the way people have responded to the film.
Yes, I've noticed that people in different places would respond very differently to the film, depending on what they knew about drones coming into watching National Bird. And what I found actually probably most disturbing is that within the United States, when I was screening the film around the country, that a lot of people were deeply shocked because they had no idea about drones, about drone technology. We had experiences where people were coming out of the film literally, shaking and crying because they had never understood from the way that politicians were communicating how drones work, that they were carrying bombs. And bombs were dropped on buildings, and that civilians were killed by drone warfare. And that was in 2016, 2017, when I was first touring with the film. I really hope that it has changed today, that people have received more information about this technology and how it works and the impact it has on people around the world. But that's what I certainly noticed here in this country. And I have to say, in some other places in Europe, I've felt and I've experienced that many people there were actually, knew more about drones and drone warfare going into the film. I think there was just more reporting at that point about the technology of drones and the impact they have. But particularly here, there was a lot of shock to the stories told in the film.
Thank you, Sonia. Jesselyn Radack, could you tell us a bit about what led you on your path to offering legal support to so many national security whistleblowers like the ones featured in this film? I imagine that it has some connection to your own experience as a whistleblower. So could you tell us briefly about that and the political and professional commitments you've made in the years since then?
Sure. I blew the whistle in the first high-profile terrorism investigation and prosecution after 9/11 of a guy named John Walker Lind, who was called the, quote, American Taliban. And he was caught fighting in Afghanistan, and they tried to prosecute him, but first they had engaged in torture. And as the ethics attorney at the Department of Justice, during the prosecution, they didn't turn over pretrial evidence that we had engaged in torture, and he had been blindfolded, gagged, kept in a coffin for many days, was starving and full of bullet holes, and got no medical treatment. And that was not turned over to the court as part of the exculpatory evidence you have to turn over. So I ended up going to the media about that. And after that, I, as an ethics attorney, was placed under a criminal investigation, referred to the state bars in which I'm licensed as a lawyer, and put on the no-fly list. So that was then, and it made me realize the magnitude and the ferocity the government could unleash if you bucked the party line, even if the party line was a lie.
Right. So you were basically shown the door at the Department of Justice and other places as well, right?
Yes, exactly. I was told I should, I mean, they were like, they were going to force me out. I resigned, and then tried to get hired at other law firms. And the government was literally calling private law firms and telling them not to hire me because I was a security threat. And I'm like, you haven't charged me with any crime. Since when is this the government's purview to try to thwart employment opportunities of people, but also literally putting them on a terrorist watch list, like the no-fly list? And at that point, it was being used for political vengeance against me and Cat Stevens and a number of other people who were engaging in ethical acts and acts of peace and acts of protest lawfully in the US. But again, these punitive measures were being used to interrupt and disrupt people's living. There was like a just kind of a gossip campaign in a lot of my social circles, in which there are tons of government people in DC. 1 out of every 10 people in DC works for the government, at least. So yeah, I mean, it was horrible to just be blacklisted, in addition to being under
Right.
investigation.
So you were effectively denied the possibility of making a substantial legal income, partly by choice as well. But I mean, you've offered so much legal counsel pro bono. I kind of wonder how you've managed to carve together, a living.
Well, basically, I started a whistleblower and source protection program, based on the experiences that I went through. I had worked for the Government Accountability Project, but then founded Whisper, because we realized source protection, it needed to be broader than just whistleblowers. Whistleblowers were part of the issue, but journalists are now being targeted. And I had always said the war on whistleblowers is a backdoor war on journalists. And we see that coming to full fruition now in a number of different cases. So it's a toxic trend that unfortunately has only gotten worse. I mean, it was kind of an
Right.
aberration when they used it on
Yeah.
Tom Drake, but now it's
That's
routine.
that's an important point. We'll probably come back to that in some form, but the government is really now not only going after national security whistleblowers, but intimidating in sources and potential sources. And, I want to come back, Lisa, to you, because while I think National Bird does a great job of giving you a pretty strong idea of why it is that the drone program is not at all as surgical as its advocates purport it to be, I wonder if you could just give us a better idea of how the system works, how targets are selected, and why things can so often go awry.
So there's a lot of things that I can't talk about, because I don't want to end up in prison. But what I can talk about is that there are certain documents, for example, intelligence oversight. The documents that guided intelligence oversight have changed over this period of time. And there isn't as much intelligence oversight, and the overclassification of information, and there's just so much. And basically I wanted to work on technology as an avenue to help people, and I didn't see in the beginning that the same technology that you use every day is used to kill people across the globe. And it's growing and it's expanding, and the data that is collected by these devices. During the Obama administration, there used to be, the different agencies had their own basic fiefdoms. They were, the data that they collected was pretty much separate, and they would share it with each other as I mean, the best way to describe it is say manually. But today there's just these large pools of data that include somebody that sells you a cup of coffee can be purchased by the DoD and put into their data that they've accumulated, that they use to target individuals. And when you think about it, the company line is that all of this data and the analysis of all of this data is going to clear up the fog of war. And it is not possible where you have all of this, some of it like really mundane, trivial data on people, on everyday human beings that carry these data collecting devices with them wherever they go now in the form of watches and cell phones and that kind of thing. And this data can be collected, and there's not much in the way of overseeing governance on how long it's stored or where it's stored. And it's done, and it's done in a way that's secret. The public doesn't have any, so there's a lot of analysis that is purportedly done, but what the public sees is only what the public is permitted to see, unless brave people like Daniel Hale and others, and Jesselyn and so many others come forward.
Thanks. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the claim is often made that targets of drone attacks are individuals who are either known to have committed terrorist acts or planning them, or because of their behavior have created a sort of quote signature of activity that makes them a target. But the idea is that they would just be individually struck. But in practice, isn't it the case that if they are surrounded by a group of men of military age, often in practice defined as basically anybody over 12 years old, could be regarded as legitimate, target if they're standing near or driving with the individual intended target. Never mind the real difficulty often of distinguishing ages and gender, through these cameras. I know there's certain things you can and cannot say, Lisa, but can you have what I just said a fair enough account?
It is, and there's a couple things that I'd like to bring forward. The United States has normalized the idea of firing a missile to kill an individual target. That is basically not the norm. And the cultural competency, I mean, we're talking about cultures that operate in communities, that get together for reasons, funerals, weddings, soccer games, and all of those people that were blown up by a missile. There's no logical way that all of those people could be quote unquote enemies. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that that no one is immune. Under the Geneva Conventions, there's supposed to be the opportunity for people to retreat. And how is it that anybody can retreat from a drone when you have no idea? Teachers are struck, anybody from any walk of life has been struck. And so basically there are people walking around that are in constant terror of these loitering devices. And as far as, who is targeted, it's really hard to tell. It's really hard to, you couldn't take a list of people that were targeted or killed in a certain amount of time and actually find out, there's no way of knowing. So, and that's a big gaping hole. There should be a way for the public to understand and to know this information. And we're seeing the same thing happening in the war that's going on now, right?
Did you want to jump in on that, Jesselyn?
I was just going to say the fact that the US basically, when a number of innocent people would get killed in these signature strikes, the US called it collateral damage. And that's just so dismissive. The military would, have little acronyms like, oh, they were TIPs, terrorists in training, and just dismissive, dehumanizing kind of acronyms to somehow justify the fact that women and children and civilians, were constantly part of the people who were being vaporized in these quote signature and targeted strikes, and what was being sold to Americans was a lie and exaggerations and cover-ups. Even a recent drone strike, a more recent one, which the US denied happening, but then other countries had video of it happening. And then the next day they were like, oops, yeah, we made a mistake and accidentally killed someone. That was this year. So this continues to be a problem.
Yeah, and if I could chime in, it occurs to me that even if we were able to do the impossible and hit only intended targets with no collateral damage, there's an underlying question is, are any state-sanctioned assassinations morally and legally justified in international law? And there are big debates about it, but there was a period starting in 1976 when President Ford issued an executive order prohibiting political assassinations. Now, the language was murky. Was it just to leaders, or could you still kill somebody defined as a military target? And it certainly didn't inhibit Ronald Reagan from trying to assassinate Muammar Gaddafi, or in the 90s, Clinton trying a cruise missile trying to kill Osama bin Laden. But it's certainly, we've had international debates about landmines and biological and chemical weapons. There certainly could be a lively effort, to try to ban the use of drones as military weapons. Maybe we'll come back to that as a project, how we might sort of advance that cause. But I'm turning to Daniel Hale. Yeah, go ahead, Sonia.
There's so many thoughts that I have about this. When Lisa was talking and about the technology, I think one of the issues is that there's a lot of blind trust in this type of technology, especially by people who don't know a lot about it. And I think that's one of the issues, how mistakes happen and how failure happens, because there is this belief that you send a drone and you see everything, but you don't. In the case that I'm portraying in National Bird, where only civilian victims were killed, including children, is that there was a lack of cultural knowledge and cultural context. Where the drone was following a group of cars, and these were all civilians. They were just traveling, and at some point the car stopped, and they were praying. And the drone operators who were captured, there was a transcript released as part of a military investigation. So we actually know what the drone pilot and the sensor operator, the co-pilot, were talking about. They didn't realize that, prayer, like the daily prayers, are part of the local culture, but they actually interpreted it as a preparation for an attack. So that's one of the flaws in the systems. And in terms of counting the civilian victims, when you drop a bomb on a building, a house, do you really know who's inside? You have to make a concerted effort to go out and investigate on the ground and see who was killed. And I would argue that in many of the cases where airstrikes are hitting buildings or neighborhoods, that unless there are people there and there's an investigation on the ground, which the US military is not always having an incentive to do that, they might not even know how many civilians they are killing. And that is the other complexity with using drones in very remote areas, not having eyes on the ground, not having local intelligence, and just dropping these 300-pound bombs onto buildings after monitoring them for sometimes a pretty short period of time. And I'm sure Lisa has more about this to say, but I think there is this trust in technology without thinking all the way through, without having all the background knowledge. And it's the same with AI now, with autonomous, semi-autonomous systems, where these technologies develop and people think, oh, it's a solution, it's clean, it's surgical. And only after using it in the aftermath, years later, is there an incentive to try to understand where the flaws in the system, what are the problems, how is it actually impacting whole societies?
I would add on to what Sonia just said. You also have every mainstream TV show, all mainstream media portraying drones as precision, accurate, awesome, cutting edge, kick-ass weapons. And so it's very hard to compete with the narrative in film, in Hollywood, on the news, everywhere, about drones being this wonderful thing. And then your kids are like, I want a drone for Christmas. I mean, it's so normalized that like tons of people have drones for very innocent and sometimes very good reasons. But unfortunately, they're ubiquitous now. What we were talking about back when National Bird came out, now fast forward 10 years and it's just so normalized and part of everything and glamorized. It's hard to put forth a competing narrative.
I'd like to throw some reality into the conversation about drones. The last strike that happened in Afghanistan, it was on a building that was a US NGO. You would think that in all this massive amount of data that they collect, that they might have certain specific places that are United States NGOs, that they might like eliminate those places as far as targeting is concerned. And no one would have ever really known that, except for the fact that because of the withdrawal, there were media organizations actually there. Then I'd like to point out that it was the highest military official in the country that sat there to the American public justifying this strike on, again, an American NGO, and 6 different ways from Sunday justifying it was a righteous strike. And it wasn't until a newspaper organization went and got video that saw that these things were water bottles. And did that family ever get out of Afghanistan? Were those reparations ever made? I don't think so.
I noticed that we are starting to get some questions from the audience, which is great. And we will get to them. I just ask you to be a little bit patient, but we will at least the last 30 to 40 minutes turn to some of your questions. But there are a few things I'd like to get to first. As I mentioned, Daniel Hale, one of the whistleblowers featured in National Bird, obviously can't join us because he's doing a 45-month prison sentence. I'm hoping that Jesselyn Radack can tell us a little bit about his case and how it happened. One thing I will preface that by is to say that there's an amazing scene in National Bird, because it's shot before Daniel Hale was charged. But you do hear Daniel talking about having his house raided by more than 20 FBI agents trying to collect evidence. So he was already clearly a suspect under the Espionage Act as early as 2015, but didn't actually get prosecuted until about 4 years later. I mean, that's one question I have, Jesselyn. I mean, why did the government take so long to go after him?
Basically, yes. So search warrants were actually in 2014. And then under Trump, Attorney General Jeff Sessions said, we're going after leakers. Now that seems quite ironic given how much Trump is being accused of leaking and prosecuted for it. But at the time, he was like, we're going after leakers. We're dusting off all these old cases, as well as bringing new ones. So he ended up bringing like 3 times the number of prosecutions, dozens of charges, and it reinvigorated Daniel's case. So suddenly, here we are in 2019, and Dan's case comes back to life. And all of us, all of the attorneys, and there were multiple attorneys, had thought it was just done, over with. They dropped it. There was no way this would come back to life. But it did, and it did for political reasons as part of Trump's then war on leaks. And so suddenly this was, Daniel was moving on with his life and just trying to live like a very low-key existence, not trying to be in the public eye or anything like that. And then suddenly he was arrested, and this whole thing became activated again. And because it was under the Espionage Act, it became, like all of these cases, incredibly difficult to defend that kind of case.
In part because judges don't allow people prosecuted under the Espionage Act from making a public interest defense. In other words, talking about their motives, which are often enough deeply patriotic and wanting to serve the country, not to help some foreign enemy fight against us.
That's exactly right. It's a strict liability offense. So either you made the disclosure or you did not. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if you did it for fame or profit or revenge, or if you did it because you thought the public had a right to know what the government was doing in their name, and because the government had been lying about what it was doing. And this dates back to Dan Ellsberg, because he was targeted under this law, and then it lay dormant and then got resurrected many 40 years later, and then has unfortunately continued to be used with increasing popularity. I mean,
yeah, actually, what's one interesting thing about the Ellsberg case compared to cases of the 21st century is that they were actually allowed, Ellsberg and his co-defendant, Tony Russo, to put the war on trial a bit and to talk about their motives. They, anti-war activists like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky brought into court and testified. So it's not actually clear that the jury would have convicted them if it had actually gone to the jury. Very different climate politically in terms of support for truth-telling and whistleblowing, I think, then than there is now.
Also, all of these cases are being charged in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is a most conservative court in the entire country. And it's in the backyard of the Pentagon and NSA and CIA. I mean, it's the entire intelligence community would make up a jury. That's why a lot of these defendants opt not to have a jury, but just a bench trial with the judge.
Yeah.
And again, there's no defense that you can really raise. You can only raise your public interest motivation during sentencing, after you're already convicted.
And this one is for anybody. You may all be in contact with Daniel, and we can maybe put up in the chat ways of getting in touch with him and supporting him. How's he doing?
All things considered, I mean, he's just an incredibly strong person. He is not in a regular jail, even though the judge realized that Daniel struggled with PTSD and anxiety and depression, and Daniel was open about that. And the judge recommended that he get some kind of therapeutic incarceration at a place that had a medical center that could try to help with these issues. They instead put him in a communications management unit. There are only 2 in the country, and they were created specifically to house terrorists. But because he is in this communications management unit, his communications have been thwarted, including with me, and I'm one of his attorneys. And attorney-client communications are supposed to be sacrosanct. And at times I've been deliberately, trying to reach him and make phone calls for like a month and not getting through.
Lisa or Sonia, do you want to add anything to that?
So I've talked to him recently, and all things considered, yes, he's doing okay. But like, he is in a communications monitoring unit, and they brought him into jail early with this kind of pretense that they were concerned about his mental health. And not only was his mental health impacted by the drone program itself, but also he was under this basic sort of Damocles for over 7 years under the threat of prosecution. And that in itself was, I mean, he wanted to go to school to center his education as part of his life. And due to what can only look like spite from, I mean, he was unable to do any of those things.
Mhm.
And the judge, during his sentencing, during his trial, basically understood that what Daniel was trying to do was the right thing. The other thing is that the no-fly list that Jesselyn was on, while it wasn't classified information, it was next to impossible for attorneys in the United States to take people off of the no-fly list. One of the pieces of information that Daniel released was instructive to attorneys who were trying to take people that were just for no reason whatever put on these no-fly lists during that period of time, which interrupted everything. But basically, like most whistleblowers that end up in the position that Daniel's in, Thomas Drake's in, or whatever, they're ostensibly silenced. And the thing is, it's perception management. As long as the state is the one that is doling out the information about these people, then the public, while they have the right to know, they don't get the opportunity to hear the truth, basically.
National Bird, you can actually see, pretty much in real time what impact the investigation has on him, because there is a scene in the film where you can, when he starts talking about the raid, and it happened in the middle of production. So I was one of the first people he called after the FBI raided him. And then after, discussion with Jesselyn, who became his attorney, and my attorney as well, because my attorney said I would be raided next, because we had been filming for, a substantial time. We decided to continue filming him. And what you see in the film is actually chronological. And I think you can actually, really witness and feel the impact that this investigation has on him, which is secret. You don't get any updates. You just know that the government is putting you under surveillance, that everything, all of your communication, your most private messages, all of that is, being searched through and investigated. And, you just try to imagine for yourself, like, how do you live after that? You know that all of your personal connections, everyone who's in touch with you, every relationship that you build is under surveillance. So people who, never agreed to be part of this, and I think that was a lot of Daniel's concern, would be tied up in it. And so what it meant for him is he always wanted to protect everyone else. So he just started isolating himself from his community, his friends, and really, fell into this, like, I would say it was almost like a depression. And there's a scene in the film where you see he's just indoors, and it's really hard for him to go to study and leave the house. And that was really what I witnessed. What was happening is that he couldn't engage anymore with anyone else because of that sword, Jesselyn called it a sword of Damocles that was over his head. And that was going on for so many years. And then by this time where he might have thought, and we all thought, like, what can happen after so many years? And then, Obama left the case, open, dangling. And so for the next administration, for the Trump administration, it was there to take and then start to prosecute, all these whistleblowers, and really going after whistleblowers. And what I think as a journalist and as a filmmaker, it's also, the Espionage Act, through our sources, is going after free press. and is really, there's a chilling effect. People are worried, they're concerned. Can you report about this? Can you talk about this? Like all of, the Espionage Act and the war against whistleblower is impacting, I think, very, very deeply our free press and our, free society.
I'm going to come back to you with something, but there's a couple of quick questions I think I can answer from Catherine. Daniel is scheduled to be released, I think, next June. Is that right?
July 24th.
Okay, next July. So that was one question. Also, the film National Bird is available on Amazon Prime. Just wanted to repeat that because there was another question. Sonia, when you watch the film, it's clear you were being very careful about not wanting to put these whistleblowers into greater legal peril than they already were in. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about that challenge. And also, it occurred to me that one thing that you did to help preserve make them as safe as possible was not to film them together. Was that a conscious choice not to bring them on screen together? They're interviewed always separately. And I thought maybe that reflected a concern that they might be brought up on conspiracy charges down the road, but maybe not.
Well, I did a lot of compartmentalization during the production of this film. And it was, I always considered this to be a high-risk project. I think it is, anytime you do any reporting in the space of national security, it is risky. And I think what we have to do as journalists, as filmmakers, and, working with attorneys like Jesselyn, who can represent whistleblowers and sources, is that we have to try to minimize the risk, but it's always there. And I think that's very important to understand, not to discourage people to do important reporting, but to try to take as many precautions as possible from the beginning. And what I did, and what I can, really recommend, if there are any students listening who want to get into this field, which I do recommend. I think every film, every independent, journalist who does this type of investigation, and someone in the chat was recommending Ahmad Khan's work on civilian victims of airstrikes. This type of work is so important, and it can't be enough of it, because we need this type of information to make good political choices, to vote, to understand what our politicians and are actually engaging in when they are engaging in wars. So I think this reporting is crucial, and I want as much of it to happen as possible. However, we all have to understand there is a severe risk, especially as long as the Espionage Act is still on the books, because you can go after whistleblower sources, after publishers like Assange, after journalists. And what I did at the beginning was I actually went and consulted with Jesselyn to understand the line, as much as possible. Like, what can we report about, as safely as possible? Where are we getting into territory that would be considered, risky? Can we talk about that, it's how difficult it is to, like Heather in the film, she's an imagery analyst. What can she talk about in the difficulty of her job without crossing a line into where we talk about technical capabilities? And there's actually, there are a lot of things that she is able to talk about in the film without crossing a line. But I think it's important for everyone on the team to be aware of the risk and work with attorneys. I highly recommend, going out to Whisper, getting consultation and advice ahead of time, ideally. Same for the journalists and the filmmakers. Have your own, I think sources and filmmakers should have their own independent legal investigation, and then just be slow, be careful. Try to gather information and discuss the risk with your participants.
Sonia is one of the only investigative journalists filmmakers I know who actually has bothered to do that ahead of time, thinking about these things ahead of time. Unfortunately, there are far too many out there who are perfectly willing to burn a source. They don't want their sources to be burned, but they're not going to do basic stuff like using encryption or consulting with an attorney ahead of time. I mean, there's so many little steps you can take along the way to try to, including Sonia doing editing in Germany, I think, as well as to keep stuff safe. I mean, there's so many things you can do. And not enough people are worried about that. Not enough people in the media who are writing these stories, who are making documentaries, and burning your source discourages other people from ever coming forward, and it ruins the life of the source, of course. So,
but there is something, the Espionage Act, I think, should be challenged, because it is countering a free and independent press, in my opinion. And there's a severe chilling effect, because it requires so many resources, to make a film like this, for example, to do investigative journalism. That's why independent and freelance journalists are doing some of the best work, because it takes so much time. You really, like a lot of the big media outlets, they don't do this investment. It's often independent freelance journalists who just, volunteer a lot of their time over years to do these type of investigations. But it's very, very difficult for all of them and all of us to get the resources to protect ourselves, because it costs money. It costs money to travel, costs money to get extra computers, it costs money to have the type of tech support, to have more hard drives, the encryption, having places to store them, traveling around, going out of the country. It's really it's a big challenge. And I think anyone who's listening here who cares about like factual, real good investigative journalism and information, should feel part of this conversation, and really take part of this, and support independent journalism
and support organizations like ours. We barely, like, year to year, it's always wondering, like, are we going to have enough funding just to pay ourselves? We're scrapping every year. There are a lot of mainstream organizations. I mean, there are organizations that claim to do what we're doing, but are not really doing it. And then, larger groups that would have the capacity to do it, the ACLU or whatever, that were very hands-off about Daniel. They were happy to do Edward Snowden and said, we're going to support whistleblowers. But there was just an unfortunate silence from a lot of the bigger organizations when it came to Daniel's case.
There's something else that I'm afraid of. It's a fear I have. So one thing, when Sonia came to me about her film, she had binders of information that she went, and you could tell that she did diligent research and preparation before she broached the topic. And that was incredible to me. She had things in that binder that I was not aware the public knew, that I was not aware that I could talk about, right? And then there's another thing that I want to point out about the Espionage Act. Everybody is full of fervor, or a lot of people, I can't say everyone, but are full of vigor. They really want to see the former president charged under the Espionage Act. But I want to point out that the Espionage Act is bad law all the way around. So it doesn't matter whether bad law is used to prosecute somebody that I don't necessarily like or agree with, or whether it's somebody that I care deeply about, like Daniel Hale. The Espionage Act is bad law. And if we want the future of these investigations, of this kind of journalism, to be able to continue in this country of ours, I think that we need to take a pause and look at the law and not who it's targeted at.
Thank you all for that. I want to shift gears just a little bit to say that one thing that's very compelling about the film is that you develop a strong empathy for people who were part of the drone program. and come to an understanding of the psychological and moral trauma it can bring to them. And Heather's story particularly captures this. And she finally, in the end, seeking recognition from the VA of a PTS diagnosis that would give her some compensation, which she does get. I think she's the first person in a drone program who was recognized with PTSD. On the other hand, the film does not exclusively focus on the Americans involved in the drone program. It also makes the very bold and brave move to Afghanistan, and a trip to Afghanistan that Lisa takes and that Sonia accompanies her on. I wondered, Lisa, if you could tell us a little bit about, your motivations for going to Afghanistan, which, by the way, was still in the midst of warfare, and what the impact of that visit was on you.
The thing about the drone program, the thing about this situational awareness that the DoD claims that this kind of thing gives you is so far from the truth. And I wanted to see what was actually going on the ground. I wanted to talk to the people who, to me, are the most important people to have in conversations like this, the people who are directly impacted by these weapons. And I met people that you wouldn't, because my neighbor Asma was from Afghanistan. I met people that, as A, a woman, and B, a former military member, would not normally meet. I met somebody outside of the film that was from the Kuchi tribes, and they've been nomads for centuries, since biblical times, and they're actually homesteading today out of necessity. So that entire culture is seeing a significant change that is brought about due to technology that we're using to kill people on the other side of the world. And the families, I mean, to see, like, you could see the people who were impacted. You could see the fear. And I wasn't afraid of the Afghans. Like, a lot of people would talk to me, why are you going to Afghanistan? Aren't you nervous? The same things that I would have said years before to others that I knew going to Afghanistan to visit, right? The things that you find on the State Department's website that say, be afraid. I wasn't afraid of the Afghans. They were welcoming. Before all of this, before the whole terrorism thing, they were known for their hospitality. And they are the most hospitable people. They're strong, they're resilient. They've gone through things, and I'm going to get teary-eyed, that we can't even fathom. And yet we continue to put people in these countries under these conditions. For what? Extractive industries, for what? Today, the Taliban is the de facto government of Afghanistan. So what was all of that for? And these things are being done in our name. And as Americans, we can watch it on television and change the channel. But when you live in these countries, you don't have that privilege. And I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to raise our voices. These are our tax dollars that are killing people. These are our tax dollars that are, and we need to somehow facilitate these people to be able to come and witness for themselves the things that occurred. I don't want to have to speak for, for folks in Afghanistan. They should be allowed the privilege. Sonia was the first person that asked this family to tell their story. With all of this amazing technology that we can reach out and go blow shit up, we should be able to reach out and have a conversation. And yet that's not the priority. And I think that that's one change that really needs to happen.
Sonia, what moved you to include Afghan voices in this documentary? And what are some of the stories that you found most compelling?
Yeah, I mean, that was always, like it's at the forefront for this film to to show the human impact of this war. That's how I started out. I wanted to, first when I had the idea, and was around 2012, I was doing research, like what do we know about, drones? And I was reading, the articles in the newspaper, and there was so little information. And at that point, drones had been used in 2012 for, over a decade. The first reported drone strike was in October 2001. And there was, barely any information. There was not a single person at that time who was speaking out from within the drone program. Not even anonymously in newspapers. Like there was so little information because it was all secret. And of course, like extremely limited information of the impact of the people, most impacted, who are the people in the target countries, the victims and survivors of drone strikes. And we often talk about, also in the reporting today, about people who are killed, but people who come out, severely injured, who have lost their legs or their limbs, their lives are forever changed as well. And so when I was doing the research on drone, I always researched in both directions, because I didn't think you could do one story isolated from the other. I think if you have to understand how drones work and how they operate, which the operators, the people who are, part of the system, can explain. And they work very differently, I think, than most people imagine. Most people just think about the pilot who's flying the drone, but there's a whole system behind it that Lisa was part of, like a surveillance system, a system that finds the targets and their flaws and problems within every part of the system. And then the impact it has on people fighting this war, because what was communicated to us at that time in particular was that it's safe, surgical, this is a clean type of war. And what I found out during my research was that no, it's actually not. Like, people who are fighting the war are severely impacted. They are like almost everyone who I spoke to worked with drones knows people who have committed suicide. And then is, of course, this like the biggest impact is in the target countries. What Lisa has been describing, the change of society and culture, the airstrikes, the fear from the sky that children grew up with, and that's what I really needed to show firsthand. And I researched a lot of different stories with our team in Afghanistan, and we actually intentionally are not naming the families. We know who they are, but to give them at least one small layer of privacy. But we were able to research multiple families and survivors of very current drone strikes. And the reason I chose this one case is because it was so well investigated and documented by the US military, because I didn't want to have what you also see today, kind of the backlash and people saying like, oh, did it really happen? Were they really civilians? Like all like the criticism that could come up if I would have taken more current case. And in this specific case was investigated by the US military, and they found out themselves that these were only civilian victims, and the drone crew was primarily responsible for the strike on the civilian victims. But yeah, this it is it's one story of many stories.
So you actually interview a mother sitting next to a badly wounded child who lost a leg, who also had two of her other children killed, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
Lots of those kinds of really horrific stories are in the film. Starting to get some questions from the audience. People are really interested in what to do. Someone wants to be reminded of the group that Jesselyn Radack works for. I'm sure we got it up in the chat somewhere, but you might want to just repeat that, Jesselyn, and make a little pitch for donations, maybe.
Yes, we are, surviving on a shoestring. It constantly is a battle to try to get funding for this kind of controversial work. I run the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program at Exposed Facts, And again, the information should be hopefully up as part of this presentation. And also we run the standwithdanielhale.org website too, to help our client Daniel. And again, we are just 3 attorneys, very small operating budget, and just taking on, it's a David versus Goliath struggle when you're up against the full force of the entire executive branch of the US government. And Congress doesn't want to touch these cases. So if they do an investigation of torture or secret surveillance, it's the Intel Committee, and it's done in secret, and you're not going to be privy to the outcome. These cases are often under seal, so you can't read about them in the courts either. We are one of the few ways that these cases get communicated to the public: torture, secret surveillance, war crimes, drone assassination. We are a safe conduit for that information to be made public, and thank God for people like Sonia Kennebeck, who are doing the important work of also trying to bring this out. And again, these cases take years. Her films take years. You can't just say, oh, we're going to start here and finish here. It's a trajectory, and it can go on for 5 years, 10 years. Daniel's case is going on into the 10th year, and it's going to continue for him even once he's out and gets to transitional housing and has to try to reintegrate into society. I'm sure he will bump up against more barriers. So it's not a linear thing, and it's not like a quick thing to do this kind of work.
You know, someone is really interested in how we get more access to classified documents about these secret programs. I mean, you have successfully gotten a lot of declassified documents or unclassified material that help make the case, but I'm sure you also submitted a lot of Freedom of Information Act, requests to get classified documents. That too, speaking to Jess's point, takes forever.
I've won 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the FBI, but it takes years. And so it's extremely challenging and time consuming to even get documents that are not classified. And there's a big issue of over classification. But I have to say, I think it is possible to get access to documents, and we all have to keep pushing, because every citizen can actually do Freedom of Information Act requests. So I think we should all push for more government transparency.
You can do them, but then when you get the exemption, oh no, you can't have access to this, then having to take that next step and sue, that's often prohibitive for a lot of people, especially small organizations. And you would pretty much need to partner with a law firm that's willing to help you out. And again, it can take a really long time. It's great that we have that law. But I also have I've gotten responses where one agency has classified a document, the other one has it not unclassified. And then there's some 200 hybrid secrecy categories, like for official use only, sensitive, but classified, but can be used internally. I mean, there are all these different categories of classification. And as Sonia pointed out, a huge problem with overclassification. I've seen like baby announcements get stamped classified. What? I mean, it's an absurd problem. But it also goes to something Sonia had mentioned earlier about like bulk collection and the US just collecting all this information. And like, if you're looking for a needle in a haystack trying to catch a terrorist, then why would you just keep making the haystack bigger? And why would you keep just over classifying everything? And then it can't become declassified for 70 years. And then you see some of the stuff that gets declassified that should have never been classified. According to the US's classification czar, he's looked at documents in Reality Winner's case, in Daniel Hale's case, in these cases, and said, none of this stuff should have been classified. So I don't know why someone's being prosecuted for disclosing it to the media. It shouldn't have been classified in the first place. Yet here the government's ruining lives.
Overclassification has become a worse and worse problem. And many experts I've talked to and read say that while maybe a 1 or 2% of government documents need to be temporarily classified, probably 98 or 99% never should be classified, certainly not for more than a year or two. It's mostly to keep information that might be embarrassing. Go ahead, Lisa.
So what is really important to know is that we as individuals, we need to avert our gaze from this like partisan crap that's being tossed around back and forth. We need to start looking at some of the serious problems, and especially like as students, we need to start like talking about overclassification more. We need to start talking about how overbroad the Espionage Act is. We need to start, instead of looking at the individuals, instead of looking at the people, we need to start addressing the systems that are in place that are making these things possible. A lot of activism that I've worked with and stuff, there's this idea of selecting a target, somebody who's in power. And to me, that's kind of an old idea because the systems are so embedded. They're so, they're just so normative now. They're so ubiquitous that
including corporate people profiting off this pervasive new system of. I want to get to a few things. I had a few questions about the response of the psychological community to PTSD and moral injury among people part of the drone program. Is it your sense that the psychological community is making steps and stepping up in response to it and recognizing in a more serious way the psychological fallout of drone warfare, or not so much?
I've read it. I've read that things were being addressed on different bases, but I've never seen the fruits of that. I've seen people at the VA facilities, but I mean, to me, there's not really that much that's changed. There's not, and when I've tried to help other veterans that maybe don't have the money or don't have the resources to get psychological help, early on there was a lot of, you could go to the list of people in that profession that had volunteered to help people, and that list has gotten next to none. So I think there's also a lot of fear surrounding it. There's a lot of fear that's propagated about veterans, that we're going to go crazy and blow up something, or and a lot of that adds to how difficult it is to seek real help.
And at the same time, there's an epidemic of veteran suicide rate in this country. And yes, it is going largely unaddressed, the suicide rate, but also why people are suicidal and why there has not been intervention available earlier. It was certainly an issue in Daniel Hale's case, just trying to get approval. I mean, again, people having to have security clearances to be able to talk, the psychiatrist having to have a security clearance, a military clearance to be able to even talk to people about the dark ops programs. And unfortunately, we're running a lot of dark ops programs that are leaving people with severe moral injury. Most of the clients I've represented in the drone program at best have struggled with issues of addiction, issues of depression, and a huge number with suicidal ideation, and just having trouble just functioning because of what they did in our government's name with the government's approval, and they got rewarded for it, and they got little certificates like, you killed this many people, like that were supposed to be like la-di-da, like, you did this great stuff, you get bonuses for this. And how just the cognitive dissonance that is caused by by that and going on for years and years. It's staggering to me. And again, the battle that Heather had to fight to get PTSD to be recognized as a valid injury.
There are also programs that point to where veterans should get together and go boating or go sailing or go what, and those are great, but they don't address the root cause of the problem.
That speaks, Lisa, to a book I recently read and reviewed by Nadia Abu El-Haj called Combat Trauma. And her basic critique is that a lot of the therapy directed at veterans in general is of the kind of the empty gesture, thank you for your service, and treating them as victims rather than as people with full agency who are indeed wrestling with moral and political issues and conscience, and that need in fact to acknowledge that and find ways of, as you, Lisa, have yourself talked about, finding some restorative justice or some effort to make amends.
Critically, these programs that I've been a part of and participated in, they continue the othering of real human beings, that there's no reason for them to be considered an enemy.
Yeah.
They don't put an end to that. And I think that we need to focus on humanity. I mean, that sounds, trite, but for me, going to Afghanistan was part of my healing. Talking to people who have been victims of these atrocities, of these war crimes, that has been, healing. And I think that would be a good tact for, people in general to take.
A number of people, I think, want to push you a little bit on how you would define national security, and do we need a new definition of it? And are there instances where the leaks of classified information might actually threaten our national security, or at least the people who are involved in national security operations? So anybody want to take that on?
I want to say one thing about that. So the one thing that I want to say about that is, it's interesting that there's that side of the fence, that people who are continuing to say that what you've done damages national security. Okay, let's believe that for a minute. Let's allow that to be presented in a court of law. Let's not deny that discourse to actually happen, because I can tell you from my own personal experience that a lot of things that they think threaten national security are like pole vaulting over mouse turds for some corporation to make a dime.
Well, I think it's very telling too that when the government in a number of these cases had to submit a damage assessment of the leak, they weren't able to. They didn't. They just did not. So to me, again, certainly certain stuff, I agree, should stay classified. Sources and methods, undercover intelligence identities, nuclear design information. People are like, she just wants everything to be public. No, I think certain stuff is properly classified and should stay that way. And certainly Trump giving nuclear information to countries that are our enemies, that kind of stuff is incredibly problematic. So it's not that I think everything should be out there. I just realize that for a lot of the stuff that people are actually being prosecuted for, by and large, it's been stuff in the public interest, from Chelsea Manning to Thomas Drake to the dozens of drone whistleblowers, to Snowden. I mean, it's all information that was being done in secret by the government, and that the government was actively lying about when a few Congress people got wind of it, or when the media got wind of it, and the government just blatantly lied.
Yeah, or the case of Reality Winner as well. It's so remarkable in the sense that it's, she disclosed one single document about Russian election interference, which, it's actually proven that her disclosure led to reforms of election security, and by experts, was saying that it made the 2020 election more secure. but she got 63 months in prison for that one single document.
And that document was later made public during the Mueller investigation.
Right.
And reality, just to point out that because of her security clearance and because of all of that, can still not talk about the document because it hasn't been officially declassified.
I do want to end on a more some hopeful notes about what we can do and progress, but there is one obstacle that we haven't really discussed, which I know Lisa's working on, and that is the increasing role of artificial intelligence and technology in general, playing a bigger and bigger role in military affairs. How far away are we, to put it as bluntly as possible, are we from having a pilotless fighter jet and big pilotless bombers going off on missions with artificial intelligence deciding targets and dropping munitions?
Is it okay? So the one thing is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible to be accurate? I'm not convinced. I mean, if you look at some of the artificial intelligence, I mean, there are places where artificial intelligence can be a good idea, not in targeting people, and there's not enough discourse about, there's a lot of talk about how there needs to be a human in the mix, how there needs to be a human. There's not a lot of talk about how or where. I mean, because all of us, we've used spell check, right? Can any one of us say that we spell better now that we've depended on it? I think the same is true with any of these technologies. The more we depend on it and the more we rely on it, the worse our own faculties become. So yeah, it's possible. It's possible to remotely send something out to say, give this analogy or give the directions to actually fire a weapon or do that sort of thing. Yes. But where is the human in the loop? And why is there not more public discourse on that? And why are the people advising the president all look alike?
Anybody else want to jump in on that? I mean, Daniel made a really good comment in the film saying, I don't want to get rid of drones entirely. I just want to get rid of them as weapons of war. I mean, it'd be great to use drones to identify the survivors of a natural disaster, for example, or, interesting use of drones in the making of films. I don't know if you've used any yet, Sonia, but right.
We used it in National Bird.
That's right, of course, yeah, it's flyovers, yeah.
But I think, before we deploy these new technologies in war, there has to be a legal framework as well. Like that's what we've been seeing with drones too, that, our development of technology has outpaced our laws and rules and regulations, and even, I think our moral standards. And I think, at this point we should take a step back and catch up and see, how are these weapons, like theoretically, how would you use these weapons and how do they comply with international laws? I think there's so much, trust in these, and lack of understanding in these new technologies, that there are so many flaws in it that people are just blind to. It's like the same, with the algorithms. There have been actually films made about, how, biased algorithms are, and so, there are a lot of flaws in these automated systems, and so, and I think there's too much of a push of deploying it in war before people are even figuring out how it works and how it, and how our laws apply in relation to these technologies.
And a lot of the worst atrocities have been, I mean, they don't comply with the Geneva Conventions. They don't comply with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They don't, but unfortunately, I mean, there are a whole bunch of treaties and conventions and things that they're out of sync with or blatantly, violating, but there's not an enforcement mechanism. The US doesn't see international law as binding on itself. And the US continues to kind of exempt itself. Oh yeah, we're all about this, but we're not going to really be bound by it. We can be a signatory on it, but we're not going to actually like enforce it on ourselves, and we're free to violate it. And we come up with these creative ways to do that. Oh, if we put people on Guantanamo, we don't have to follow the law. I mean, if we just hold people in black sites, we don't have to follow the law. I mean, there's no shortage of like creative ways to evade international law, humanitarian law, and customary law in terms of what should be done. And technology, the law is a slow thing to develop. It's based on precedent. It takes a long time. Or you have to have a Congress that actually enacts law, which it's not able to do right now for a number of different reasons. It's pretty much frozen. But yeah, the law completely lags behind the tech.
You can, there are some really wonderful majority women's voices out there that are talking about artificial intelligence, like Meredith Whittaker, Timnit Gebru, and others. And the mistakes that happen when talking about using like stable diffusion or the new AI that is working for artist platforms and things like that, it's the technology is the same, right? So the errors that you see when you look at an individual that is drawn by artificial intelligence on the internet anywhere are the same errors. And it's like these machines can't see. They simulate sight. They take data and manipulate it and simulate it, right? They can't hear. They can't, these are machines. And part of like the issue that's happening is people anthropomorphizing them. And they're just machines. They collect and manipulate data, and the data that's found on the internet is faulty. So along with a serious lack of cultural competency and just boatloads of faulty data, how can the targets, quote unquote, ever be accurate?
Well, you've all mentioned a number of multi-tiered efforts that must be pursued, I think, to make meaningful changes in the worst of these military programs, from raising public awareness through investigative reporting and filmmaking, to grassroots organizing, to legal reform, to political lobbying, because as we've mentioned, these programs have endured under both political parties, making foreign policy more democratic through greater transparency, a more engaged Congress taking on responsibility of oversight for war and peace. So there's no magic bullet, but you've alluded to a lot of important things. So, and I think you've given the audience, some ideas for how they might get engaged in these programs. So I really, if any of you want to make just a final comment, we're sort of at that point, but briefly.
Thank you for doing this as part of the Ellsberg Initiative, because I cannot think of a better tribute to his memory, which I'm still processing. I mean, he was such a mentor to so many whistleblowers. A lot of people go through the hell of whistleblowing and want to leave it behind them. And to the credit of people like Dan Ellsberg and people like Lisa, who continue to speak out, it's so important what this initiative is doing, not only in keeping his memory alive, but keeping these issues going and keeping the dialogue going of things that people don't want to talk about, but they need to see the light of day and deserve a public hearing. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jess. And thanks to all who attended. I want to take the opportunity to invite you to our next major event in just 2 weeks on November 15th at 7 p.m. Online and in person at UMass. We'll have the second annual Ellsberg Lecture featuring the writer, journalist, and activist Norman Solomon, who is giving a lecture titled "The Madness of Militarism." That's a quotation from Martin Luther King, by the way. So I especially want to thank our three panelists for their very thoughtful responses to our questions and for their ongoing activism and opposition to militarism and on behalf of public interest whistleblowing. Thanks as well to some behind the scenes help from program manager Ross Caputi, Tim Hastings, and the Graduate History Association. So thanks everyone and have a good night.